met this girl down by the vine.
Hi, I'm Abbasi-Chavez.
And I'm Kenna Haverkamp.
And today on Nancy Drew and the Disappearance of Male Dominance, we will be talking about Nancy Drew and the Haunted Bridge.
And before we get started, I'll give this little brief overview of the plot of the book. So basically, Nancy and her friends George and Bess are on this little mini vacation together.
Little vacay.
Little girls trip.
Little getaway. You know?
At this place called Deer Valley Ranch while her dad investigates this, jewelry robbery. And
that she ends up, participating in,
Yeah, of course, Nancy
she
solves
worms
the
her way
case.
in there, yeah.
And while she's there, she partakes in this, golf tournament, and her caddy tells her about this bridge on the golf course that's haunted, and so, of course, she solves the mystery of the haunted bridge and finds out who the jewelry thief is, and she also wins the golf tournament.
Of course,
so,
it's Nancy Drew.
Yeah.
So since this podcast is mainly about gender studies and what that means in this Nancy Drew book, we'll be looking at her character through many different lenses as well as other characters in the book. And we'll do that in many ways. Kenna, you want to add in?
Specifically, we'll analyze the different ways that the female characters are sort of described, and their relationships with each other, and sort of how they either enforce or defy typical gender stereotypes. And then we'll also go into look at the male characters, how they relate to Nancy Drew and her relationship with them, and also how the author chooses to describe them in specific ways.
Her descriptions are very important.
Yeah. And I think that after that, we'll continue sort of to talk about how Nancy Drew can be seen as sort of this feminist icon, or someone that young girls for many generations
have looked up to.
Honestly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Seen as sort of this role model as a strong woman, and why she's sort of seen as a strong woman as opposed to other female characters.
Because there are other female characters that we see in the past, but there's something about Nancy and what she does and who she's friends with and how they interact that makes it special.
Yeah. And then we'll also sort of look at the time period that this was written in, and sort of the inspiration that the author drew in order to think of this character.
Yeah. So the three main female characters in this book and throughout the whole Nancy Drew series are Nancy, George, and Bess. And the way that this author describes them in this book and towards the beginning is really important.
So even on the first page, when describing Nancy, it says, Nancy, a slender, attractive girl of 18 with reddish blonde hair.
So we already see a physical description, which is, it's not a bad thing, but then we move on to
talk about George, who's described as a trim-looking brunette with short hair and a boyish name. And then Bess Marvin, their other friend, is just described as girl, blonde, pretty.
It's really interesting how the first introductions that we have to these characters, especially if you've never read another Nancy Drew book, are dominantly physical characteristics.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really dive deep into, their hobbies or what they like to do, because that can sometimes describe a person. And I think it's really interesting that especially the last character is described as
just three
words, and I don't think that does justice to her character at all.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts on that?
That's definitely true. And I think that that is true for a lot of books.
Right.
Specifically, that the first introduction typically that you'll have to a female character is through a physical description of them. And whether or not, maybe that's just a way to sort of picture the character,
right. But when you don't have any other context, especially since, it is a series, and I think that some people just know about the characters and how they are, but if you're just jumping into it, you won't really know their characteristics or how your personal opinion on the character is going to be.
Yeah.
Which I don't know that they really describe a lot of their characteristics throughout the book.
No, they definitely don't. Yeah, George and Bess specifically don't really get very much it doesn't really dive deep into
who they are,
their characters or anything.
And as a woman, I feel especially, they're kind of cheated out because
I
of the
agree.
strong female lead and how she's described.
Yes,
So,
I agree. And also, I think it's worth mentioning that the words that they use to describe the girls are all, like, attractive or slender or
Right.
blonde.
Right.
Like, these things that every girl kind of, like,
wants
or, like, sees as, like, the typical view of what
And
would
right, and,
make
like,
someone beautiful.
young girls are reading this too.
Exactly.
Not to mention.
Yeah.
So they're already getting that image in their mind that, you know, that's the typical woman. And even when they said George's name, boyish,
Yeah.
I feel like that has like a negative kind of connotation.
It does. That's what I read it as, too.
And it's kind of putting that negativity towards that character already. And
Yeah.
you're seeing her as like
Less
almost
feminine.
as if she's being separated from the other two girls because of like how she is and like her name and the way
Yeah.
she's described.
I also think it's really interesting to look at the different characters of George and Bess, and as they progress through the book, how they contrast with Nancy's character, not only in this book, but also in the entire series.
Right.
While Nancy's off doing, like, these things with her dad, like solving crime and looking at different scenes and looking at evidence and stuff, they're at the resort.
They're
which is-
lounging.
Yeah, having a good
They
time.
are taking their sweet time on this vacation.
Yeah, they're not really doing anything productive. I mean, they're, like, shopping and playing a light game of tennis and, like, I don't know, it's just, they seem less interesting than
Right.
Nancy does.
And, like,
to the reader.
is that intentional? You know what I
think
mean?
it is. Because I think it's sort of a way to portray Nancy as being different from your typical female character.
And that makes her stand out, definitely. And
Exactly.
it makes us want to be like her and want to
Yeah.
defy the stereotypes.
Right, exactly. It makes George and Bess seem ordinary.
Boring.
Yeah, like, whether that's a comment on how women are, like, portrayed in books of this time period typically, sort of as, not as interesting as maybe these male characters.
No
who are doing-
substance.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It makes Nancy look,
And in this time period,
Different.
that's really important. Like, this
It is.
progressive time period of women.
the
and-
1960s.
Right, you know, gain rights in the 1920s, and we're moving
Yeah.
forward on through the great chase of women's rights.
That's right.
That we're still running through.
That's right.
I think Nancy really represents how women are changing and how they want to be
Yeah.
seen. Like, Nancy is substance. She
Yes.
has many interesting parts to her, unlike, like you were saying, strongly contrasting George and Bess.
I agree. And I think that ties in really nicely to the essay that we read before we did this podcast. For one of the sources that Annalise and I used for our information, we read this essay written by a college student about how Nancy Drew had affected her as a young girl.
And she's one of millions of young girls that were greatly impacted by the strong character that Nancy is.
Yeah. And she highlights how one of the main things that inspired her about Nancy Drew and that made her want to be like Nancy was the fact that Nancy wasn't afraid to show how smart she was.
It's really interesting because I feel like women, especially in that time period, felt like they needed to dumb themselves down just to feel more attractive or accepted.
Yeah. I think that that's a common theme throughout just femininity in general throughout many, many decades. Even today, I think that that's still definitely an issue. And I think that that's one way specifically that Nancy defies typical stereotypes, because not only is she smart and
She's willing to show that.
exactly, but she's also like attractive and popular. So she sort of shows throughout her characteristics that you don't have to like be dumb in order to be
Pretty
or like wanted. And it's not like you're not abrasive as a female if you're like,
not
too intelligent.
Exactly. Like, there's a nice happy medium that Nancy shows. All right, Kenna, you ready to start talking about the male characters?
That's right. All right. So the first male character that we're introduced to in the book is Nancy's golf caddy, Chris. And he is afraid of the haunted bridge.
Who wouldn't be, man?
Yeah.
If
I'm
I
just
saw
scared.
that, I
would.
would not cross it.
Just have to say, Chris has a point.
He does. But anyway.
He won't go get Nancy's ball after it goes over the bridge. And Nancy's like, well, okay, I'll get it myself then. So Nancy goes and gets it. Which is I think it's important that that's our first introduction to the male-female dynamic in this book, is that
Definitely.
Nancy is, quote, braver than Chris. And then it moves in to describe this guy, Martin Bartesque.
Martin. Let me tell
Barbecue,
you a
if you
little
will.
something about Martin Barbecue.
Martin
No.
Barbecue.
All jokes aside. Martin is quite literally the definition of a negative male stereotype.
He definitely is. The way he tries to sort of, like, one-up Nancy all the time and prove to her...
His maleness.
Yeah, just, like, the way that he's, you definitely meant masculinity.
That is definitely what I meant.
But, just the way that he sort of, like, forces himself, like, into, like, the girls' lives, and the way that he tries to, appeal to them, almost, is kind of gross.
And I really love how the girls reject him
Yeah.
in that moment.
I think that it's sort of like this idea of male dominance that these strong female characters are
Rejecting.
that I really like.
And the next character is Ned.
Yeah, I love Ned.
Nancy's boyfriend, Ned.
He's in almost every single one of the books.
And in every single one of the books, especially this one, we see him, doing the work for Nancy by his own choice.
Yeah, or just, like, doing things that Nancy asks him to do.
Because Nancy wears the pants in this relationship.
She does. And I honestly think, like, I see how much he respects her, sort of, through the way that he just kind of does what Nancy asked him to do without questioning her, which is...
Like what women are expected to do from men.
Exactly. Especially women of this time period and relationships of this time period were reversed, where the women were sort of specifically supposed to do what the men would ask without asking. And Ned does that for Nancy. And so I think that's why the author chooses to have Nancy and Ned together for so many of the books.
It provides, like, a very interesting dynamic.
Yes, it does.
Taking a little break, our sponsor for today's podcast is Drew Perfume.
The perfect double wear perfume for when you're simultaneously solving crime and being the most popular girl at your high school.
It comes in scents feminism floral, girl power gardenia, charitable cherry blossom, and equality evening primrose. Doesn't that just sound beautiful, kind of?
It sounds like
I would
something
wear
Nancy
that.
would wear.
Nancy would wear that, so why shouldn't I,
Exactly.
Love it.
The next thing that we'll talk about, which I sort of think ties into the psychoanalytic theory, is the absence of a mother figure in Nancy's life. Throughout all of the books, it's just Nancy and her father. And we can see how much Nancy idolizes her father, and she really loves her father.
But she's created this image for herself as a strong woman without the presence of a strong woman.
Right.
And I think it speaks volumes to who Nancy is as a character.
I agree, and I think that we see a lot of female characters without mother figures in their life, whether it's in movies, books,
TV shows.
yeah, wherever. And it makes you wonder, maybe, how might the absence of a mother affect Nancy as a character? It says that her mom dies when she was 3. So, I mean, do you think that, like, that's part of why she is as strong of a character as she is?
I think that it's heavily because of herself as a character.
Yeah,
And,
I think
like,
it is, too.
the times in what she's gone through, and especially since we see how males in her book seem like they can just dominate her. So I think that she's definitely gained it from herself.
And I agree. I think it's sort of problematic to give credit for a female character's strength and sort of independence to the fact that they don't have a mother figure, or they have to do it because of something in their life, as opposed to, like, just doing it because they are that way.
Exactly.
As a character.
And to wrap things up, I think this book does a particularly good job at defying traditionalist gender norms. And I think that's all we have.
All right. Thank you
for today.
so much for tuning in.
Thank you for listening.
See you next time.